And she was there for what was coming up in a few days, I think, was the Grammy
Yep, it
Awards.
was the Grammys.
And she was nominated. She had come out with an album.
It was a best hits album. And yeah, the Grammys were 2 days away from her death.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by TuckerAllen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. I should tell you that I'm in Florida now, and it's been the case several times before when we do this show. When you see me remote, there's a good chance that I'm remote from Florida. I'm in Naples, but the show goes on. So today we'll be talking about someone who is a legend. I think you're going to find this material very interesting. This show may run a little longer than some of our shows, but this is a person with opportunities to learn about estate planning as well as some other things. And also, I think, a very fascinating subject. So with that, Marlea, do you want to give us the introduction of our celebrity today?
Yeah, this week we are discussing Whitney Houston. I thought it was kind of, the perfect time to discuss her after the Grammys and all of that fun. But I mean, we all know the name. We've all probably heard her music. She's very famous, very spectacular woman.
Yeah, and I think there's no better way to start than for us to let people know exactly how great she was. So we're going to kind of Marlea's going to go over some of her awards and recognition and honors, et cetera. Because even though I'm a fan of hers, I knew she was great. I didn't realize the extent to which she had been achieving in her career. So Marlea, why don't you take it?
All right. Yeah. So Whitney Houston, she had 8 Grammys, 16 Billboard Music Awards, 2 Emmy Awards, and 30 Guinness World Records. And she had a lot more awards than just that, but those are kind of the top ones. She won a bunch of Grammys back to back, and she was always nominated many, many times for them as well.
Yeah. And she broke some records in terms of sales in her albums.
Yeah,
there are a number of records.
Over 220 million albums sold.
220 million. That is incredible.
It's crazy.
And I read elsewhere that except Taylor Swift has surpassed her in some sales of female recordings. Mm-hmm. Taylor Swift is kind of nipping at her heels in a number of ways, but it's incredible. I mean, people who know her and know that she was great, they often don't know exactly how large she was in terms of the industry and the awards as well as the sales of albums.
Yeah,
so she was very profitable.
Mm-hmm. She definitely had just a massive impact. I know, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, but she took a break from music, and then when she came back, she had an interview with Oprah on one of her very first season episodes, and it was one of the most anticipated interviews in music history because she was finally making a comeback after a couple of years. But she was very influential, very well known worldwide, not just in the U.S. either, and just very good at her craft. She was amazing at being a singer, songwriter, and everything else.
Yeah, and each of her albums, though, there were no albums that were actually failures. She didn't put out that many albums compared to what we think of with some artists, but her albums were always of incredible quality and always generated lots of hits. There was one from which there came 5 successive Billboard #1 hits.
Yeah.
That may have been her first album.
Yeah, I was about to say it was her first album, which is just crazy, being your first album and the first one you put out after kind of just a childhood of singing. And I don't even think it was the influence of her mom being a singer as well. I think it was just honestly Whitney Houston herself and all of the talent that she had.
Okay, so now that we've reminded people, of how great this subject is today, let's go ahead and talk about her life.
Yeah. So Whitney was born in New Jersey in August of 1963. Her mom was a Grammy Award-winning singer as well, and music kind of ran in the family. Her dad was in the military, and he eventually went on to do some government work. But her mom, Whitney, and both of her sisters were all really musically inclined. Whitney started singing at their church, and if you've ever, I mean, I'm sure we've all listened to her songs or have heard some sort of snippet, but she definitely has a very gospel background that she's mixed with pop. And that definitely just came from her being in the church, her growing up there and singing and everything like that. And then she kind of went on throughout high school, and she started doing backup vocals in high school for her mom's band and just on her mom's albums. And she really just got her name out there. And she didn't really immediately start off being a singer. She actually went into modeling first, and she was the first Black woman on 17 magazine's front cover. So I found that really interesting, and that was in 1981 when she started teenage modeling. But she was she was featured in a couple of different magazines like Vanity Fair and Cosmopolitan, but she really got started in that career, and then she kept doing that while she was also writing and creating her albums. And then once her albums came out, her first one, they didn't know how well it would do. And then obviously, like you just said, they picked up 5 different top hits, and she just kind of grew from there.
Everything you build for you and your family deserves protecting. All of those important assets you have worked so hard to acquire and enjoy, you want to make sure they're handled with care. At TuckerAllen, our attorneys will customize an estate plan that will work for you and your family's goals and needs. TuckerAllen, estate planning, probate, and trust administration. Visit TuckerAllen.com.
Yeah, she had 2 brothers who were influential in her life. She started singing, as you said, in church very young and began soloing. She had this, there's a picture of her performing at age 12 as a soloing, and this is gospel music in her church. And so this was no small church. This is in New Jersey. She was raised pretty much entirely in New Jersey. She moved from one part to the other when she was young, probably 10 or so years old, to move. Parents wanted her in a better area. But one thing that I found really surprising was the extent to which she would go with her mother, who continued throughout her youth, throughout the youth of Whitney, continued to perform in clubs.
Yeah.
Doing though she certainly did gospel music, but her primary living, both as a group singer and as a studio singer individually, on which she appeared a number of recordings. But more than that even was her appearing in clubs around New York City. And these are secular clubs, of course. And these are not clubs, and there's alcohol served, and as you can imagine the environment. But her daughter at 16 years old was coming in and performing with her, and even went into the studio when her mother and several others were doing backup on a recording. She brought in her daughter and told the producer that, who needed an additional singer, said, well, my daughter can do this. And the producer looked at her, at this young girl, a very young girl, and thought, I don't know, I think we need to get in a real singer here. So he was skeptical, and she ends up singing on this recording, and so wowed were the people in the studio when they heard what came out of her mouth. I mean, this great, strong voice. And that this guy asked her to be on his record. He was doing a recording that didn't become famous, but the point is still, it was a recording that he was doing with a group of musicians that he had and participated in, and he asked her to be on their album. So she immediately started getting this exposure because she would hang around with her mother. So she was really in a professional environment pretty young, but as you point out, she was pursuing modeling and simultaneously thinking that modeling would be maybe the real ticket for her success.
Yeah. which was just,
and it seems odd.
yeah, it was just so funny because like her mom was well known, obviously to be a Grammy winner, you have to be fairly well known, but I think she just didn't have enough self-confidence. And I mean, what teenager does around that time to be like, I want to make my whole entire career music. But I mean, she signed her first label when she was 19, which is just insane to me.
Yeah, thankfully she was put in a family where she gained continuous exposure. And Sissy, and when we talk about Sissy, today, we're talking about her mother, who was just, everyone calls her Sissy, Cissy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, so Sissy, though, who knew a lot about singing, was very talented, of course. And Sissy, incidentally, had one at least solo album. And I think, incidentally, that's where she may have gotten this Grammy. So while Sissy wasn't famous in terms of people outside the industry, she was well known within the industry. And whenever you have a lot of work as a studio musician, you have to be good. Because studio musicians really are the unsung heroes in the music business. These are people who are so good at what they do that they can go into a studio and whoever comes in that day, anything from, in that era, anything from Frank Sinatra, maybe in the morning, Rolling Stones in the afternoon.
Yeah.
I mean, you get everything thrown at you. And some of the people who later became famous, stars themselves, were people who early in their career were great studio musicians. Dwayne Allman, incidentally, in Muscle Shoals, that studio was that famous studio. He learned a lot and got a lot of his chops, I'm convinced, during that period of time. You have to have the ability to look at music or listen to music. Some you hear stories about people who couldn't read music and yet were incredible studio musicians. So these are people who had the ability. So, a client comes in, a performer or the band, and they say to this musician, this is what I want, and the musician can hear it and produce it. So these are very talented people, and Sissy and this group of several women that she was singing with at the time, they had this reputation for being good studio musicians, singers.
Yeah.
So anyway, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah. And then, it just kind of rolled from there. And she did 2 years of sessions for her first album, which, I mean, is quite a while for, your first album. And that's probably why she kept modeling as well. But, it released, it was just titled Whitney Houston, self-titled, and it was actually released on Valentine's Day in 1985, which is kind of funny because it's Valentine's Day today in 2024.
And wait, you planned this, right?
Oh, yes, I planned this. And it spent 3 years at the top of the Billboard charting after that, which is insane to me. That is crazy.
We have to talk about the guy who came along, and it's a little strong to say discovered, but in a way it is fair to say. Clive Davis was the head of Arista, which is a powerful record company at the time, owned by RCA or whatever. But anyway, it was a big company, lots of money, lots of influence. And Clive Davis was already a legend in the industry. But he was comparatively young at the time. He was in his early 40s, I think. So he had somebody that he knew. I assume that they worked with Arista, but they actually heard Whitney perform in I guess with her mother in a club in New York City. So she would have been, I guess, 18 at the time. So he goes to Clive Davis, who's looking for this one star that will, take this label to the top. And he hadn't found that yet for that label. While he had some successes, he hadn't had the kind of success he was about to have.
Yeah.
So he was looking for that vehicle, for lack of a better word, that person who could take him and the label to that level of success. And so this person came to him, this friend in the industry, and said, "Look, you've got to go to this club and hear this young girl." And he does. He goes, and when he hears her, in his mind, it's done. He makes the decision. This is what he wants. So at the time, apparently she was getting approached by a number of labels, and her mother, to her credit, was being very selective and hadn't pulled the trigger. I think there was a separate RCA division or RCA separately that was pursuing her along with at least one other label. And Sissy was playing hard to get, thankfully.
Yes.
And so then Clive Davis comes in. And as you said, she was what, 19?
Yeah, she was 19, that's crazy.
Yeah.
That is crazy.
And he signs her up. And he goes about this very methodically. It's like he wants to create this anticipation in the market. So rather than charge into the studio, he took his time and he helped select songs. And he finally, months later, has her on, well, it may have been soon after the signature, but he had been working with her for months. And he manages to get her to come on Merv Griffith. Now, Marley, are you too young to remember Merv Griffith?
No, I remember it. I remember that show. Yep.
Okay, well, and Merv Griffith was big at the time. It's hard to understand that now because I think he was a daytime show, you know, as opposed.
Yeah, and I think it's just because my grandparents always had it like playing on their TVs, and so I remember it from like when I was very, very, very young. So, but little snippets.
Yeah.
But I know what you're talking about.
And it was a big audience. So he goes on. I've seen a clip of this. You can find a clip of this online. I don't know where, but if you search it. And so Merv Griffith is talking to Clive Davis, and Clive Davis is kind of the guest. And he already has a reputation in the industry. And so Clive Davis is talking about this great new star, this person who's going to, you know, sweep through the industry like a tornado. And then he makes this grand reveal on Merv Griffith. So she comes out. I don't remember what she sang, but man, she delivered.
She's just this little girl at this time, which I just find so funny. And everybody was like, who is this? And then she has that voice that you hear it, and it's just absolutely insane.
And she was beautiful too. And she just had the package.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I read some, I don't know if I'd call it criticism, some comments about how he changed her. And clearly she was the beneficiary of this. But given the ethos we have today, it might be viewed with some disapproval. What she had been raised to sing was very black, meaning very soulful gospel, you know, black gospel roots. And it was a style of singing, and it's a very impressive style of singing. I personally am a big fan of gospel music. But it's, you know, Clive Davis, I think correctly felt that he had to transform her into something that the secular general public, and critics would say white general public, but I would say general public, all colors. But anyway, he did. He changed the way she sang, and it wasn't that very identifiable gospel, notably black sound that is great in itself, but perhaps would not have had the potential commercially that she achieved. And so some people say, some in the tones of criticism, some just in the tone of a comment, say that, he saw that for her to become a commercial success, she had to sound different to be a great commercial success. We would know of her today if she never changed that style at all, but she would never have sold as many albums. She would never have had the monetary and commercial success that she had. And so he saw that, and he worked with her. He presented her differently, he just turned out to be the right person at the right time for her, almost like Colonel Parker for Elvis, except Colonel Parker's accused of taking too much of Elvis's earnings and maybe having such control that wasn't good for Elvis. And I don't think anybody says that about Clive Davis.
No, I definitely don't think her mom would have let her sign with them either if she had any indication that the same was going to happen. But I think he was genuinely a good guy and just saw talent where talent was.
Yeah,
because
and he stood by her. And
yes.
maybe we should walk along a little bit. We'll come back to that part of her story.
Mhm.
So continue on. Her first album's a huge record-shattering success.
Yeah, first album sold over 25 million copies worldwide. So in the US, she had 5 top hits, but worldwide, she had 7 come out of that album, which that's ridiculous to me because you never hear of 7 coming out of just your first album. And she got nominated for Album of the Year at the Grammys in 1986, which again is absolutely insane. You don't ever hear of any just singer who has who has released their very first album ever winning that or even being nominated for it.
So it makes you wonder, though, why she didn't win. Hey, Justin, can you look up and see who was that in 86?
Yes, 86.
See who won Album of the Year in 86? I'm curious because this album was so stupendous and all the hits that flowed from it. While you're looking that up, we can continue. Go ahead, Marley.
Yeah, but so she just kind of went on and moved from there into releasing her next album. I believe it was 2 years later, and this one was just called Whitney. And this one did record numbers as well. She just kept growing and growing and growing. And this was, if you don't know any of Whitney Houston's songs, you'll know this one. This album had "I Want to Dance with Somebody" on it, which is in probably every movie ever, because it's just
that may have been her greatest hit, although the one by Dolly Parton.
I know, yeah.
It was No Jacket Required by Phil Collins, which was a good album in and of itself too. But that, oddly enough, that was We Are the World was also up for Album of the Year too. So that was some tough competition that year.
I don't know. Of course, I'm not that big a fan of Phil Collins, so I can easily say they should have given it to Whitney. But anyway, so I'm sure it was influenced by the fact that he'd been around for a while and he had kind of earned his recognition.
Well, that one's got Studio on it, so that song is played everywhere. So I don't doubt that one.
Okay, all right. So she's having success very quickly, and I think that each of her albums, as we mentioned a few moments ago, each of her albums were huge.
Yeah, they do numbers. And even after she dropped her second album, she also announced her second world tour. And that it grossed as high as there was a Madonna tour that year. And then there was also, that upcoming year when she was doing her tour. And then there was a Tina Turner world tour. And she grossed just as much as they did for their tours, which
and she was
wild.
New.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
That's amazing.
And she was just in her early 20s at this point.
But Tina Turner must have been close to what, 50?
Oh, yeah. I mean, at that point, yeah, that would have been 1987. So, yeah, around there. So, yeah, she just kept doing numbers and numbers and numbers with all of her albums, everything like that. And then she did a little bit more modeling. And then she actually got into acting and she played in The Bodyguard. She played she played the actress who was getting I believe it was an actress who was getting stalked, and that one did really well. And then she went on to actually producing some movies in her later years, and you might not be familiar with these, but I'm super familiar with them. She actually produced Princess Diaries and The Cheetah Girls, which The Cheetah Girls, if you're my age, I don't think anybody listening is my age, but I'm sure their grandchildren know the Cheetah Girls like the back of their hand. We were all obsessed with those movies. And same with Princess Diaries, which Princess Diaries is a bit more well-known.
I'm familiar with Princess Diaries. I thought that was really clever and well done. So she produced that?
Yeah, she produced that. And then she also produced Cinderella, which it's not the original Cinderella, it's Cinderella's story. And they're kind of I want to call them the Disney versions of Cinderella, they are Disney, but the adult Disney versions of Cinderella. So real characters, real life. But Cheetah Girls was also another Disney one, and she helped produce that. But I wasn't really actually aware that she helped produce Princess Diaries until I saw that, but she did. And I thought that was really interesting.
So when you say help produce, she was a co-producer?
She was a co-producer.
Okay.
Yeah. So now I'm going to have to go
Wow.
back and watch it and watch the credits.
She had so much talent. And so during the 80s, she's on this big role, touring, as you said, touring a lot, recording. And then around 93, I think she had a spell of 8+ years where she did no recording from what was it, 92 to 2000, 93 to
2000, I believe.
Yeah, so it's either 92 to 2000 or 93 to 01. And that's really unusual.
Yeah.
And that might have been a red flag. And I guess people who study her life in more detail can probably explain that in terms that do involve, some of the bad habits she's developing, which we'll transition to here in a second.
Yeah, she was going through her divorce with Bobby Brown at that time too. I am not quite sure on the year that they divorced, but I know she was going through that. And then, like you said, we'll talk about the bad habits, but just kind of like to lead into that, after The Bodyguard, she actually got into drugs a little bit heavier. She, kind of dabbled in them before, per usual with every music artist, but it wasn't until after the movie that she really got into them a lot more, and during her divorce.
So, but still, before we come to that, though, during the 90s, so maybe beginning 92, during the spell we've talked about where there wasn't recordings, she definitely was busy. So I don't want our viewers to think that she just takes off 8 years. She didn't take off. She continued to do the things you mentioned. There's several movies she was involved in various ways, either on screen or off screen. So she was productive.
Yeah.
And she did some touring during that period of time too. But it is a little unusual for a great artist when you have a hungry fan base, which is in her case international, for her to sit back and not capitalize on that.
Yeah.
And so she didn't. And there probably were some good reasons for that, but I think there were also some bad reasons for that. But Clive Davis, coming back to that person, he stayed loyal to her. And there was a time when Arista, when he moved to a different position from being CEO of Arista. So later on, he leaves that role, but he continues to care about and to help Whitney Houston. And he was loyal to her, and he did what he could for her. But there's only so much you can do in that case. Before we talk about the drugs, or maybe in conjunction with that, let's talk about her relationships. And I'm going to go back to one that you may not have been planning to mention because it's ambiguous. It's not clear what her relationship was to a woman that she worked at a camp with. Robin, do you know Robin's last name? Doesn't matter much.
No, I don't.
Anyway,
but I know what you're talking about. Yes.
She developed a very close friendship. It probably was a sexual relationship. And this is at a time when this was completely unacceptable. It was a career-ending sort of thing, although it would change very rapidly. But still, I think it is safe to say in the early 80s, that would have been something that could have probably would have ended your career. Yeah. So she had this very close relationship with Robin. And they from age 16 to 22 or so, 21, 22, they were together constantly, even when they lived together in an apartment. And even when she became, her first album came out, Robin was her executive assistant.
Yes.
So they continued to travel and work together. Apparently, they had a great relationship and even did thereafter, a friendship at least. So Robin said later, yes, that's what it was. There was a sexual relationship. It was more than just a friendship. But I can tell you that there was pressure on Whitney Houston to have a boyfriend. And it was very, very clear that her family, and I'm sure her advisors everywhere, maybe including Clive Davis, would have recognized that she can't have this get out, that she's a lesbian.
Yeah.
And incidentally, and I don't think anyone says she was a lesbian. I think that those who are closest to her said, look, she had this relationship, but she also had a relationship with her husband, which we'll talk about in a second. So I think it's definitely inaccurate to say that she was a lesbian, but she did have probably her first serious relationship was with Robin, who seems to have lots of positive qualities, probably more than Bobbi that we're about to come to, the person she married. But that it's important, maybe not important, but I think it's fair to mention that relationship probably would have continued, I'm guessing, had there not been so much pressure. And Sissy even said on an Oprah interview that this was after her death, and some of you, our audience, may have seen this. She was asked by Oprah about it, and Sissy, to her credit, Sissy wasn't prepared to be politically correct or anything. She didn't care about any of that. She had opinions and she gave them. Oprah is approaching this subject very delicately, and she says, so, there were rumors about this relationship with Robin, and do you think, how would you have felt about that? She was being very gentle. Was that something you probably would have felt? And her mother was just unequivocal. Sissy said, yes, I would have disapproved. And so Oprah circles back and says, so that's something you wouldn't have thought was a good thing. And her mother said, absolutely not. And so you can be sure. So that was an intervention in her life, intervention or interference, maybe a better word, but that you wonder, had the forces not come in and change that, would that have ended up being better for her than the way things went with Bobbi and other things? We don't know. We can only speculate. But so I know less about how she met Bobbi or that situation. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I believe she just met Bobbi through some mutual friends, and part of me kind of wants to believe, like you were saying, with Robin, they were trying to get her out of that, but part of me wants to kind of believe that it was a bit of a PR relationship to begin with, just from that standpoint of she needed a boyfriend. Because, like you said, here's this beautiful young woman. Why isn't she with anybody? And they eventually went on to get married. And I don't think at really any point it was ever like a wondrously happy marriage. They did have their daughter, Bobbi Kristina. And I think, they were good for a bit, but Bobby Brown definitely led Whitney to a lot more drug abuse, a lot more just stress between the both of them, just kind of everything there, and that's kind of why it just led to divorce.
And they both were using. I mean,
yes,
Bobbi,
yeah.
they used drugs together, and you
yes.
can imagine that's not a recipe for a successful marriage. So things went down fast, downhill fast.
Yeah, they were not married for very long.
Yeah, I think they divorced in 2005, I believe.
Yes. Yeah.
So they were married maybe 7 years.
Yeah, I think it was only 6 or 7.
So there was a lot of domestic violence, and I use that word as somebody who represented men in domestic relation cases, and Cordell and Cordell still does. I know that sometimes things are unfairly characterized as, just the guy who is being physical with the woman, but sometimes, and I think in this case, even according to Whitney, it went both ways. So, I mean, they both were violent with each other. They would, police were called numerous times. Clearly, Bobbi was inappropriate. I mean, I'm sure that I know he's, according to what she said and what police said, there's evidence he had struck her on one occasion. Then there was another occasion where Whitney clearly had been striking him and he not her. So it was a mess. It was a mess where these two people were not capable at this point in their lives of having the right marriage.
Yeah. And that's why a lot of me thinks that, and it's never been confirmed, that it was a PR relationship and then they just kind of got stuck in it. because everybody loved it so much. And they were like, okay, well, like he was there because she was Whitney Houston. She had a lot of money, and she was there because she didn't want to, be pushed out of her money and be shamed as a singer for, who she wanted to be with and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. So we should also mention that her brother, she had two brothers, and they were influential with her. And I think both were older, right?
Yeah, both were older.
So she, one in particular, has in interviews has admitted that he was using drugs at the time, and he introduced it to Whitney when she was young, and the brother doesn't characterize it as if this was some campaign to get Whitney to use drugs at all. I mean, I can imagine that this is a guy who's all screwed up and he's using drugs, and his sister sees him and wants to try it, and he doesn't discourage it. So I mean, it's culpable, but it wasn't it wasn't as diabolical or whatnot as you might imagine. But the point is, she ends up using drugs early. Yes. So this didn't start when she was 30. I mean, this started when she was 18, probably. I think that was what her brother, that's what he was describing, 17, 18 years old. So, and remember, she was in a world where there was lots of drugs anyway when she was growing up, and then her brothers too. So that went on for a while and just got worse as her ability to buy more drugs increased.
Yeah. I definitely think a lot of it had to do with, like you said, her ability to buy, but just her fame increasing too, because like I said, it wasn't until her big movie that she started using a lot, and she probably was around a lot of actors who used a lot of like heavier drugs, and she had only dabbled in them to begin with. And then she did that movie, and then she met Bobbi, and I think it just kind of went down from there. And she just really got into it. She did a lot of cocaine. She was caught with meth. Nope. Not meth. She was caught with marijuana a couple of times, and just an assortment of pills, all kinds of things.
Yeah, I was under the impression cocaine was the thing, her drug of choice, but I'm sure it was lots of things, and alcohol and always is a part of it.
Big part.
So she deteriorated, especially after the year 2000. Yes. She did manage to put out this album in 2001 that became very successful, did it not?
Yeah, she re-signed with Arista, and then she put out, I cannot remember the name of the album. Justin, can you look that up for me?
So, but it was, I know it got excellent critical acclaim.
Yeah, it was. Whitney. Is it that one, or is it just Whitney?
Love Whitney is a compilation album released in 2001.
Okay, then in December 2002, she had Just Whitney. Okay,
and that album was released to good reviews.
Yes, it was. And I mean, in the year 2000, people really started to not like her because she would be late everywhere, and this was, all to her dealings with drugs. She would be late everywhere. She skipped out on a lot of things. Clive Davis was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and she was supposed to perform, and she was a no-show.
Yeah, I hated to hear that.
I did too.
When I read that, I'm sure she had the good intentions of coming, but like all addicts, the time comes and there's competition for her attention with some drug-related thing, and she fails to show for something that important. Now, we should add that too. She tried to make that up. He was getting an award for a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which was that wasn't the one she missed, right?
It was the one that she missed was his induction. The award was not the one that she missed.
Okay, so he ends up getting an award later, several years later, and she had a surprise appearance. So he didn't know she was coming, and so she showed up, and I'm sure that was an effort to compensate for that letdown before. But as you said, during this beginning around 2000, she just had this reputation for canceling a lot. She would be on a tour and just cut it short.
Yeah.
And, you can, a lot of people forget, unless you've been in that situation, what it's like for a fan to have bought what in today's dollars would be $150 ticket. And then you plan it and you talk about it and you get there and and sometimes you don't find out till you're there that evening.
Yeah.
It alienates fans.
It definitely does. And she was fired from a couple of performances too. She was supposed to perform on the Academy Awards and she kept showing up. And when she kept showing up, she was high on drugs and she would sing the wrong songs and all kinds of things. And she never admitted
in the rehearsals.
Yeah, in the rehearsals, and she never admitted it to anybody that she was fired. But then, the producer of of the Academy Awards that year, he put out a book later on when he retired, and he talked about the incident and how he, kicked her out of the set and all kinds of things. So, I mean, it just goes to show she was going downhill, and her family had multiple interventions with her. Robin was one of the people who she kept asking her to, get help, and eventually she just walked out of her life because she just couldn't do it anymore. Her mom held multiple interventions, and she did eventually go in like the early 2000s to a rehabilitation center, and it was like a 30-day rehabilitation, and she got better for a little bit, but then, she just kind of fell back into it again.
And then there was another also episode where she went in-house, right? At least a couple.
Yeah, there was one, I believe, in 2005 where she went in for that 30-day, and then there was one closer to her death in like 2009, I think, where she went in.
Yeah. So and that is true that I never read anything about Robin participating in any drug use with her. But to her family's credit, those around her, her brothers probably weren't in a position to be of any help to her. But I think that Sissy for sure and others really tried to be helpful. Clive Davis even ended up lending her money. She managed to. You think about all the things we've described here today, the many millions of dollars at a time when $1 million was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And for her to have gone through all this, and we're coming to her death here. And you think, how is it possible for someone to have made so much money? And there's not evidence of fraud here as there are, when you read about many rock stars, they tell stories how they signed contracts and they were ripped off and their managers stole their money. And, you hear lots of those stories. They're true in most cases.
Yeah.
But in this case, I didn't come across any of that. I think that, she had honest management. I think she was paid what she was supposed to be paid. I'm sure there's always some dispute about how much, but or whether it was fair. But the point is, she went through a lot of money, and you just shake your head and think, how can you be so successful selling among more records? Only a few people in history have sold as many records, or a handful, and yet managed to go through that money.
Yeah. It's crazy to me. Yeah, but I mean, so in 2011 is when she got enrolled in another rehabilitation center, and this one she thought, she came out and her family thought, oh, she's gonna make it, she's gonna be fine. She was casted in a role in the movie Sparkle, which will come up again, kind of as we'll see once we get into her estate and all of the money. And then she quietly got back into drugs again, and her family wasn't really aware. And in February of 2012, she died from an overdose of cocaine and heart failure. And it was tragic. So
kind of setting up the setting. She was in Hollywood, in Beverly Hills, and she was there for what was coming up in a few days, I think, was the Grammy Awards.
It was the Grammys.
And she was nominated. She had come out with an album I think a live album or a best hits album. Do you remember
Yeah, it was a best hits album. And yeah, the Grammys were 2 days away from her death.
So she's in Beverly Hills as a nominee for an award, and you would think life would be looking up, but as you described, she dies in this hotel. I think she was literally in the bathtub. Mm-hmm. I thought maybe the coroner's report included drowning, but the drowning can't be said to be the cause, because he said that she apparently had a heart condition and she had this huge amount of drugs in her system. Yeah. So it's just sad. So she dies, and this is in 2012.
Yes, in February 2012.
How old was she? Like 40?
She was 48.
48.
Yeah.
You know, when I was a young man, that would have seemed old, and now it seems so young. Just think how many more years.
I know.
Earning power. She was still very attractive.
Yeah.
One thing I should mention is we talked about her decline in terms of her professionalism and her work ethic, and that did occur. And also her appearance. She became skinnier and skinnier, and people would comment on it in interviews. And she, at one point, admitted, and this may have been an Oprah interview, actually, an Oprah interview after the year 2000, where she, Oprah asked her about her drug use, and she admitted it. She admitted that she had used drugs.
Yeah, that was the interview where she said that crack is whack, and I make too much money to buy crack, but she admitted to using like cocaine and stuff.
Yeah. She wasn't her best in that interview, in my opinion. So she just became a bad representative for her career. I mean, her interviews weren't good, and her demeanor, and how can it be when you're in the throes of something like that? So she talked about the fact that she was real skinny, and she said that it was due to the drugs, and that she still tried to protect her health, but obviously she wasn't protecting her health.
Mm-mm. Yeah, no, not at all. And it was just, like I said, it was very tragic. I think not just obviously for her family, but for everybody in the world. I remember when it happened, and I mean, I didn't grow up in the time necessarily of Whitney Houston's like most popular music, but I still knew who she was, and I still was very familiar with her songs and everything like that. And she had just finished a world tour too, her final one. And yeah, but 48 is just, like you said, that's so young. She had so much time to go.
And I think that the stress probably of that tour probably had increased, resulted in her falling back.
Yeah, I agree.
And using and Colonel Parker made one of the arguments when he was sued later by the family after Elvis's death for mismanaging him, alleging that he should have let Elvis travel and do world tours, that Elvis would have made so much more money than being in residence in Las Vegas, where arguably he just kind of vegetated and deteriorated. But Colonel Parker's argument, which may have been correct, his defense was, look, I knew Elvis, and I knew that he was very, very vulnerable to stress.
Yeah.
And that whatever he did in Las Vegas, he said, I can tell you that if he were on a world tour, he would have deteriorated and fallen apart much sooner. He said Elvis couldn't handle a world touring to where, it's true, it would have generated more money, but it's not realistic. Elvis couldn't have done it and been healthy.
Yeah.
So,
and I kind of think that's what happened with her too, because I think her fans then, and especially in her last world tour, just expected a lot more out of her than she could give. And I mean, like, you have to think of everything that she's been through up until then. And reportedly, like, it didn't get a lot of good reviews. It got a lot of negative reviews. A lot of fans walked out during the tour, and just all kinds of things. So I'm sure that didn't weigh on her well at all. And that would have caused, even more stress and more anxiety and all kinds of things for her.
Yeah. And a little off point, but just an observation is that, when you look at people who are in the throes of addictions, musicians particularly, and some manage to continue touring, and holding up better than others. I guess it's like being a functional alcoholic. I guess you can be a functional drug addict with respect to any drug. And I was reading of a similar story relating to this, what we're talking about here, when I was looking at Grateful Dead and Jerry Garcia. And Jerry Garcia, he would do these world tours, and with even though with Grateful Dead he was clearly in the throes of addiction, continuing using, but he promised that at the end of the tour he would go into treatment. Well, I think that he gave himself the license because he had made this promise that he could go ahead and be unfettered in his use, because he's going to go into treatment when they end the tour. And so he would deteriorate rapidly on the tour, and then he would go into treatment. Jerry Garcia did this several times, and finally, his health was so bad with in his case, diabetes and other things, that it ended up killing him. But apparently, touring and drug addiction is not a good combination.
No, yeah, I think we've seen that a lot, but yeah.
So we're going to pause here and conclude this segment of the life and estate of Whitney Houston. This material is a little longer than some of our material, so we wanted to break it into two parts. So I'm hopeful that you'll be joining us for the next segment. This has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by TuckerAllen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit TuckerAllen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.